Today on Inspired Money.
I want to spend a minimum of 80% of my life inside of my zone of genius doing this, creating content and having products and services that allow me to motivate, encourage, entertain, educate, inspire people. That's what I want to do. And I don't want any of it have to do with all this technical stuff about podcast cables. And so I'm like, well, if I was to shut down podcasting A to Z, how could I make a living?
This is episode 91 with business mentor, life coach, and motivational speaker, Cliff Ravenscraft. Welcome to Inspired Money. My name is Andy Wong, a managing partner at Runnymede Capital Management. Each week, we bring you an interesting person to help you get inspired, shift your perspectives on money, and achieve incredible things. From making it to giving it away, Inspired Money means making a difference, creating something bigger than oneself, and maybe, just maybe, making the world a better place. Thank you for joining me. Hey there, Inspired Moneymaker. Welcome back. If it's your first time listening, welcome. Inspired Money is different from other personal finance podcasts because we don't want to just learn how to live with money. We want to help each other to live richer lives, make a greater impact, and together, make the world a better place. If you're into podcasting or online entrepreneurship, chances are pretty good that you're familiar with today's guest, Cliff Ravenscraft. Or maybe if you were into the TV show Lost, you might know Cliff and his wife Stephanie from their hugely popular fan podcast and blog dedicated to the TV show. Cliff is an entrepreneur previously known as the Podcast Answer Man. He built an online brand around podcasting, offered courses, and helped tens of thousands of people to launch podcasts. And surprisingly to many, in recent years, Cliff completely left his brand behind, and he's working on even bigger things. In this episode, you'll learn why Cliff left the secure job at his parents' insurance agency to become a full-time online entrepreneur, the importance of finding your marketable skill. For Cliff, this meant figuring out how he can make the biggest impact on others while monetizing it, and the power of mindset to get past your own limiting beliefs so that you too can achieve bigger and greater things. Now let's get inspired with Cliff Ravenscraft. Cliff, welcome to Inspired Money. I am so excited to have you on the show.
Andy, I am so honored that you invited me on your show. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Let's jump right in. What's your earliest childhood memory of money?
Ooh, you know what? I do know my earliest childhood memory of money. I remember saving pennies for an FM transmitter radio. So gosh, this is before boom boxes were big. And I just wanted a FM radio with a cassette player that was all my own, and I can't remember how much it was or anything like that, but I certainly remember my mom and dad saying you have to save up some money, and I don't know how I was getting money at the time, but I do remember that I would save pennies in a jar, and every time I had 50 pennies, I would have a penny roll, and I would fill it up, and I had nickels, and I remember putting nickels into their wrappers, and I guess somehow I had some quarters as well, but I can't remember. Maybe let's have $20 and change, $25 and change or something like that. And I'm like, I think I have enough. And my mom and dad took me to the store. And in my mind's eye, if I close my eyes, I can literally see the radio that I purchased with my own money after saving up. And it was, if I can imagine, it was about the size of, it was just a little larger than a cigar box, if you remember cigar boxes. And it had one big round speaker with a black grill on it. And on to the right-hand side, it had a cassette player with the buttons and everything. And then it had an FM display of the needle that goes back and forth when you twist the thing on the side. And of course, it had the big aluminum antenna that the telescoping antenna. And I remember that being the first recollection of money for me, is saving up for that thing that I wanted so bad.
That's really cool. And it's funny because today my kids, they have no idea what a cassette tape is, or they barely do. And your kids, if they're saving up, they have to save $1,000 for an iPhone to play their music, right? On Spotify or something.
Yeah, well, for my kids are a little bit blessed because I am one of those early adopters, and I want a new phone every other year. I don't get the one every year, but ever since the iPhones have come out, every other year I have one. And I started with the very first original iPhone. And so I would buy one, and Stephanie would get one as well. And we have 3 kids. So the oldest 2 got our hand-me-downs, and then they matriculate down. And of course, we have 3 kids. So all of our kids have iPhones, but our kids have our hand-me-down iPhones from the previous generation.
We do the same. Now, Cliff, I know that at one point, and this goes back quite a number of years, you were once on a career path following, I think, your dad in insurance. Can you take us back to that time and to why you made a change?
Well, I never wanted to be an insurance agent. So my dad, who was my stepdad, he's actually, I'm adopted now. As an adult, I was adopted. But so my dad, his father, he started this insurance agency in 1937. And my dad took over that insurance agency from him. So my mom and dad owned this insurance agency. And right after I got married, I was still working these crazy jobs. Like I had, prior to my career in insurance, I had jobs such as I was the manager of a beeper store. This is like the precursor to having cell phone stores. We did actually sell some of the first cell phones. I worked in a sign shop for people who needed signs. We would create signs for them. I worked, customer service in a call center for Staples catalog orders. So I had all these kind of fancy jobs, right? But here I am getting married, and my wife and I are working these very low pay jobs. And my mom and dad said, "Hey, why don't you come work for us in the insurance agency?" I said, "Listen, I have no desire to sell insurance." And they said, "Well, the thing is we just purchased this software, all of the quoting and all of the customer information and stuff like that. It's all needs to be logged into computers these days. And they just came out with this Windows 95 system, and supposedly we're able to connect them to each other with something called networking. Do you know anything about that?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I can set up your TCP IP protocols and get your computers all networked up and stuff like that." And they said, "Well, why don't you come and be our computer administrator for our agency? That's what we'll pay you to do." And of course, they were going to pay me rather well to do it. And I'm like, okay, this sounds intriguing. If my mom and dad are going to hire me to come run their computer systems, that's right up my alley. That's who I am. I'm on board with that. So that's how I got into as an employee of the insurance agency. The only thing is it took me about 3 months to go from unboxing all of the computers, installing all the software, configuring it all, networking, figuring out how to connect to the internet via a 300 baud modem, and downloading patches and updates. Then not only learning the insurance software, but teaching and training, all the people in the agency on how to use this software. It took me about 3 months. And after about 3 months, I didn't really have anything to do except for at the end of the day, I would do tape backups of the computer server. And so here I am, my mom and dad are paying me hourly, and the only other thing that they had for me to do was to do paper filing. So all of these, they still had paper backup of everything, and they had these big, huge filing cabinets, and they pull out client files and all this stuff, and all the files that had been pulled throughout the day needed to be filed back. And so here I am, making a living, obtaining new, fresh paper cuts every single day. Not what I anticipated when I signed up to do all of this computer work, right? And certainly was not fulfilling, and it was boring as all get out. I was getting paid well, but it didn't mean much to me. Now the thing is that I learned how to quote auto insurance and home insurance and life insurance and all these different policies. And what happened was I created some forms that my mom or my dad or any other agency in the office could complete. So basically it asked that they would actually get on the phone with the prospect. They would get their name, address, social security number, all of the driver's license information, car details, all of that information, and they would fill it, they would handwrite it into this form that I created and photocopied. They would then give me that completed form, and I would go in and do the quoting for them and print out these on a dot matrix printer. I would print out all of the different variations of the quotes with different deductibles and different coverage levels and all this stuff with all the various different pricing. So I would rip that off the printer after it was done, and I would hand it back to the agent, and they would pick up the phone and they would give them the price. The client would come in, sign the application, and the agent made all the money. I make nothing. And so my dad comes to me, he says, you're doing you're like doing 95% of all the work. All we're doing is picking up the phone and giving them the price.
And collecting the commission.
They said, but it's illegal for us, in the state of Kentucky, and of course it's the same in pretty much all the states in the United States. It's illegal for us to give a commission to anybody that does not have a license. But if you were to go get your license, we could give you a finder's fee or a commission for each policy that's sold. And I'm like, okay, well, what's involved in getting my license? And so they said, well, it's a 40-hour class, and you have to pass a multiple choice computer test to show your proficiency for what you've learned. So they signed me up for the course, and I sit in this class, and it's as boring as all get out. But, I recognize the terms that are being said because I've been putting that information into computers. So I caught on pretty quickly, and I went down to Frankfort, Kentucky, and passed this test. And lo and behold, I have an insurance license for property and casualty, which means I could sell auto, home, and business insurance. And now I'm taking the phone calls directly. I'm not filling out anything by hand. I'm just literally putting the details right into the computer, and I'm giving them the prices right over their phone, and they're instantly making the decision to come in and sign the application. And unfortunately, now the thing is my dad made a huge mistake, and I don't know if he'll listen to this interview, but he made a huge mistake. He decided that he would keep me on salary or paid by the hour, but he would give me, instead of giving me commission, like the insurance agents typically make 30% commission on auto and home insurance. And instead of giving me 15% and the agency getting 15%, he decided he's going to continue to pay my hourly salary, 40 hours a week, whatever. And I would get $10 for every policy I sold. But still, I sold quite a few policies. So it was a nice bonus, but it certainly wasn't 15% of the commission or half of the commission. Or actually, it might have been 14% commission, and I would have got 7. But either way, I would have made out a whole lot better had I been given commission and he completely eliminated my salary. That's what he should have done, but he didn't. So anyway, because of that, I had a nice paycheck, but it wasn't like anything all that special, right? Then there was we were selling so much insurance. My dad had been selling so much life insurance through the agency that he began to win all of these incentive travel trips. So Grange Life Insurance was one of our companies that was very notorious for sending agents on very lavish trips all over the world. And my dad won a trip every single year outside of the United States, and he won a trip for an entire family inside the United States. Like they went to they would pay for your entire family to go to Disney World every 3 years, and then on the off years they would go to other various places like Hershey, Pennsylvania, and all kinds of other fun stuff. He said, hey, I can't go on all these trips, but you and Stephanie could go, and you could take the kids. But the only thing is they will only allow licensed life insurance agents to go. I'm like, I get the picture. And so I sit there and I said, so you want me to go get my life license, right? And he says, well, if you want to go on these trips. I said, well, I'll tell you what, I'll go get my life insurance license. But here's the deal. On life insurance, I want whatever the agency makes, I want 50% commission of whatever the agency gets as a commission. And he says, done deal. And that was easy for me to negotiate for him because that life insurance isn't something people typically call and say, hey, can I get a quote for life insurance? Whereas with the other stuff, the agency would have sold the auto insurance policies and the home insurance policies no matter what, because people were calling for that. Life insurance is something you typically upsell people into and have to convince people of the value in having it and why they should. And so he's like, man, if he sells these are policies, that's commission that wouldn't have happened anyway. So it was very easy for me to sell him on that. So I went and sat in another class, and I went down to Frankfurt, passed the test. And now not only do I have a property and casualty license, now I have a license to also sell life and health insurance because they're a combined license. So once I discovered this is about the same time I discovered Dave Ramsey and about this idea of living debt free. And Dave Ramsey had this philosophy of never buying the investment style insurance, but buying term life insurance long enough to cover what it would take for you to get out of debt and invest the difference in other ways, so that by the time that term life insurance policy would run out, you'd be so independently wealthy you wouldn't need that to rely on anymore. And I totally bought into this, and I became an advocate for helping people become debt-free and also understanding their absolute desperate need to have term life insurance until that actually occurred for them. And I had a success rate of probably selling about 80% of every person I talked to about life insurance, I sold them a policy. So much so that I represented two different companies. This must have been 25 years ago, but I actually represented two different companies. One was Grange Life Insurance, and out of 14,000 agents, I was in the top 10. And Auto Owners Life Insurance, there were 48,000 life insurance agents, and I was in the top 50 of them. This is in the same year for both companies. And the interesting thing is, if you know anything about life insurance, and if anybody out there does, how agencies make money on life insurance, with term life insurance, the premium is extremely low. But on term life insurance, you get whatever the commission is, the agent gets, I think it's either 80% or 100% commission. So basically, pretty much everything you pay for your first year of your term life insurance policy, the agency gets that.
So that's very attractive for you.
Exactly. But the other thing is that permanent life insurance is way more expensive than term life insurance. But you get a smaller commission, a smaller percentage, but that percentage, you get that year after year after year. So what is the most beneficial to the average insurance agent is to sell permanent insurance, because the premiums are higher. While the commission is lower initially, it's ongoing. And so ultimately, the insurance agent makes a ton more money in commission when it comes to selling permanent life insurance. It's better for the agent, but it's not necessarily in the best interest of most clients that are buying life insurance, in my opinion. So anyway, I'm only selling term life insurance. Now, the thing is, though, is these contests that are ran by these insurance companies, the contests are based upon the amount of premium sold over the year. So it's basically, it takes me, let's just say, 15 term life insurance policies to equal the premium of one premium insurance policy sold by another agent. Yet, to give you an idea, and by the way, most other agents sold only permanent life insurance.
Right. That's where the incentives are.
Exactly. But what I'm telling you is that in spite of the fact that those 48,000 agents with auto owners and the 14,000 agents with Grange Life Insurance are all pretty much selling permanent life insurance policies, I was still in the top 10 of Grange Life and then the top 50 of auto owners. That's how much term life insurance I was selling.
Yeah, so you were great at what you did.
I was great at this. I was great at persuading people to make a decision that would add value to their lives. And that's when I discovered what sales really is. What happened was people would come in. Let me give you a great example of this. The 23-year-old young guy comes in. He just bought a brand new car. All right. But he's required to have not only liability insurance by the state of Kentucky, but he's also required, because he got a loan on it, to get full coverage and to show documented proof that the bank has been listed as a lien holder just in case there's an accident, right? So this 23-year-old guy comes into my office and says, I need a quote. How much is it to cover this car full coverage? And I'm like, well, let me get your information. And is there any other drivers? Yes, I have a wife. Okay. And do you have any kids or anything like that? But they're not of driving age. Really? How old are your kids? How many you got? I've got 3 kids. They're, let's just say 3, 5, and 7. All right. Awesome. Cool. Does your wife work from outside the home? No, she stays at home. She's full time. Then I said, what do you do for a living? And I find out what they do for a living. How much do you make a year? I make probably about $50,000, $60,000 a year. It's like, cool. That's awesome. Do you have a home? Because if I quote your home, no, I haven't. We live in an apartment. I'm like, no problem at all. Let me ask you this. Do you have any debt? Credit card debt and anything? Yeah, we got a couple cards and stuff like that. And student loan debt, anything like that? Yeah. So how much life insurance do you currently have? And he's like, life insurance? I don't have any. I don't want any life insurance. I'm like, oh, okay. Well, let me go ahead and get you a quote for the auto insurance policy. And so I'd give him the quote for the auto insurance policy, and it's going to be about the same as he'd get anywhere else, right? I said, well, here's a quote for your auto insurance policy. Here's a quote for your auto insurance policy with a life insurance multi-policy discount. And basically it saves him $10 a month on his auto insurance, right? And the life insurance policy is $120 a year. So basically the life insurance policy is for free. So do I need this? I'm like, well, let me ask you this. It seems like you've got about $140,000 in debt total. If you were to die, what happens to your wife and your 3 kids? He's like, oh, I never really gave that much thought. I sit there, I said, well, what if I told you that this $120 a year premium policy, which by the way, you're getting for free because it's going to save you that much on your auto insurance, basically that's going to pay $150,000. It basically completely pays off all of your debt. Your wife doesn't have to go out and get 2 or 3 jobs just to make ends meet after you pass away.
Yeah, so it's a no-brainer.
Yeah. And he's like, oh my gosh. And so, and then he's like, okay, I'll take it. And I said, now, do you want to know how much it would be to get a life insurance policy on your wife and kids? And he's like, well, why would I need one for my wife and kids? My wife doesn't work. I'm like, well, let me ask you this. If something happened to your wife and she were to pass away, do you think that with your current setup financially that you could hire somebody to take care of your kids for you while you're at work? Oh, no, probably not. I said, heaven forbid anything ever happens to your kids. Do you have the money do you know how much a funeral costs? And I'm just having these conversations. Like, these are things these people had never thought of. And by the time this 23-year-old guy walks out of my office, he's got an auto policy that he came in for. He has an apartment insurance policy to cover all of his personal belongings. And he has a term life insurance policy for himself and a term life insurance policy for his wife with child insured riders on those policies. And in essence, it may have cost him $15 more per month than had he chosen to only take the auto insurance policy. And now the entire family is covered with life insurance. This was like mind-blowing to me, and not to mention the fact that I also talked about the difference between this kind of life insurance policy and the permanent life insurance policy. And I introduced every single one of these 23-year-old guys to Dave Ramsey and this idea of becoming debt-free. Fast forward to today, there are still people today. Unfortunately, I was in insurance long enough for 12 years that I can tell you right now, I've had a number of telephone calls from the spouses or the actual gentleman that I spoke to in the office, where one or the other had passed away, and they actually said, hey, that life insurance policy, how do I submit a claim? And there are literally people's lives, financial lives, that were saved as a result of my taking the time to educate them about this need for life insurance. And so that's the one thing that, as an insurance agent, that I did love, was selling people on the idea that there's something of value that is available here that you're probably not aware of.
Yeah, you were helping people, and you were helping people in a way that many of your fellow insurance agents were not. So you stood out in that way. And it seems like you kind of stumbled into this occupation where because you needed to get the licenses, I would have assumed that you were getting more ingrained into the life of the agency. And you were good at what you did. You were helping people. That part was fulfilling. But what happened? Why did you end up leaving the insurance industry?
So you're right. I mean, as a result of doing this stuff, I became debt free over time, and my things were progressing along. And what happened was, for me, this was becoming very financially rewarding. One thing I forgot to tell you, Andy, is that when my mom and dad asked me to come work for the insurance agency, to come set up their computer system and this agency management software, I made them promise me two things. Number one, I made them promise me that they'd never expect me to get my license because I had, at the time, no desire to ever sell insurance. All right. That was pretty much something that I knew that I didn't want to do at the time. The second thing is that my greatest dream and my mission and my passion was I wanted to find a way to do ministry full time. In fact, at the time, I was convinced that one day I would pastor my own church one day. And I said, if an opportunity ever arose for me to leave the insurance office and to pursue ministry full time, regardless of how much less I might make doing full-time ministry, you have to be okay and not give me a guilt trip about leaving such a secure and financially prosperous career in insurance. And those are the two things I made them promise me. So that's a little bit of the backstory that I left out. So what happened is I felt like I was doing a great service in this world by not only, I think there's a great service in the auto insurance and homeowners insurance. Certainly, there have been a number of accidents that were reported over my 12 years. Their cars were totaled and those were replaced or paid for and stuff like that. Certainly a number of house fires, tornadoes, and wind damage and hail damage and all that other stuff that were taken care of by insurance policies on homes that I had insured. But these life insurance policies, though, that was the real kicker for me. That's where I really felt like I was adding the most value because, quite frankly, no mortgage company is going to let somebody go without an insurance policy, and no bank is going to let them go have a car loan without getting an insurance policy. These people are going to have insurance on those things no matter what. But the people who called and the families that were financially saved as a result of the life insurance claims that were submitted, those things are things that would not have happened had I not done what I felt called to do in a ministry perspective, which was to convince these people of the financial need for this. This is something that nobody's going to ask you to do this. The only time anybody ever called and said, I have to have a life insurance policy, how much is it? And that's when somebody was getting a divorce and the court ordered the husband to have a life insurance policy and named the kids as beneficiary in that scenario. But that happens so few and far between. But all these other life insurance policies, it's because I took the time to educate these people on their need. And as a result of that, I had people lined up out the door like that. Just imagine that 23-year-old kid. He goes home and he tells his brother and he tells his mom and dad, Mom, Dad, do you have insurance? Have you thought about this? You need to go talk to my friend Cliff. And so that's how this all happened. So I'm thinking, man, I'm really doing ministry. And so I'm thinking maybe this is my ministry in the world. As an insurance agent, I feel like I'm doing something of great value.
Right. And meanwhile, it is lucrative for you. You're making a good salary plus the commissions, and you were able to pay down your debt following Dave Ramsey. So I'm assuming that you and Stephanie could do your celebration and right? Like the Ramsey, like yell and you scream and you're like, all right, I've done it. I've accomplished it.
Exactly. All of that. And here's the deal. We're thinking this is great. And all of a sudden I'm now starting to think, maybe I will take over the agency when my dad decides to retire. And in fact, it got to the point where about a decade after being there, about 10 years after being there, my dad actually has all of the paperwork drawn up by lawyers, the agreements and stuff like that, number one, if anything happened to him, that everything would be transferred over to me. But the other thing is that when he retires, it's all of the paperwork was in place that when my dad retires, I would own the agency.
Coming up, Cliff will decide to leave his family's insurance business, so we'll talk about his life as an entrepreneur and more. But first, it's got to be difficult to give up the security and the money.
Now, at the time, remember, the life insurance commissions were lucrative for me. I was still making, granted, I was making more money than most anybody else my age that I knew, but I still wasn't making tons of money. I was making about $87,000 a year, which is not bad. And I live in Northern Kentucky, so that is a really good salary. But the reality is that if my dad would retire and I took over the agency, I'm looking at my income going to about $1 to $1.5 million a year in personal income. So that's the future that I was working toward, if you know what I'm saying.
Which sounds pretty good to me.
Yeah. And not to mention the fact that, talk about job security, the chances of me getting fired from the family business is nil. And so, that was my future.
The show notes for this episode can be found at inspiredmoney.fm/091. If you're listening in your car or wherever you are, check the show notes if you want to learn more about Cliff or things mentioned in this episode. It's time for the Runnymede Money Tip of the Week. If you're a longtime listener, maybe you've heard this already, but I like to remind you once a year to check for unclaimed funds. Sometimes when you've moved addresses, you might have left behind an old bank account, and there could be uncashed dividends, refunds, or distributions leaving some money in the account. Approximately 1 in every 10 Americans has unclaimed property, and even if it's only a small amount, added up, billions of dollars have been lost. I'm going to keep this simple and short. First, you could potentially have unclaimed property in every state that you've lived in previously. Go to unclaimed.org. That's unclaimed.org. This is the Association of State Programs. You'll find all the information that you need there. Now, most states participate in the national database at missingmoney.com. If you're driving or not at your computer, I'll have these links in the show notes at inspiredmoney.fm/091. Basically, you enter your first and last name and your state of residence. You hit go, and it will return a list of names. Look to see if one of your previous addresses is listed. If yes, you follow the instructions to redeem your funds. Now, we once found about $15,000 for one of our clients, so go check for yourself. If you find money, big or small, please let me know by tweeting #InspiredMoney or in our Facebook group at inspiredmoney.fm/Facebook. That's the Runnymede Money Tip of the Week. Inspired Money is brought to you by Runnymede Capital Management. We help you to plan, invest, and worry less. Now, the stock market is starting to get a little volatile again. Trade war concerns are high, and tariffs generally are bad for business and the economy. If you need help or have a question about your portfolio or financial situation, schedule a 15-minute call at inspiredmoney.fm/15. We can talk about anything. Your money, the show, your 401k, whatever you like. I'd love to hear from you. You're listening to Inspired Money. I'm Andy Wong.
Going back to your question, why did I leave? And it all happened because I discovered the world of podcasting. So it was December, was it December 10th, 1990? December 10th, 2005 is what it was. And Stephanie and I were watching this TV show Lost, and I had already discovered the world of podcasting as far as a consumer. I was listening to audio podcasts back in June of 2005. I was listening to a bunch of podcasts about the TV show Lost, where they were sharing all kinds of hidden clues and stuff like that we miss as casual viewers. And I'm like, oh, this is so cool. And so one day I left some audio feedback for one of the existing Lost podcasts at the time. And it was a 3.5-minute piece of audio feedback about a theory that I had just blogged about on my blog. And I had screenshots to support all of my conclusions and everything like that. So I submitted this, and the next thing you know, I hear my voice in an audio podcast, and I'm like, oh my gosh, that's my voice, and it's being heard all over the world by all these Lost fans. That is so cool. And I remember just thinking how awesome that was. And it reminds me of when I was a kid and I would call in and request a song on the radio, and it would be tape delayed, and I would hear my voice on the radio, and I'm like, guys, did you hear me on the radio last night? That was me. And so I felt like, this is so cool. And basically what happened was my blog, which I had a blog since 1996. If you recall, the reason why I came to the insurance agency is because my mom wanted my computer skills. My dad bought a computer back in the 80s called a Commodore VIC-20. He never used it, but my mom bought it for him, I think. And I pulled it out of the box and taught myself how to program BASIC using the owner's manual. So that I've been playing around with computers since I was 8 years old. And I've always been into geeky tech stuff. So I had this blog, but nobody read my blog. I mean, maybe 50, 60 people a month would read my blog. And I did this 3.5-minute audio file, and I mentioned my blog where they could see the screen captures. And the next thing you know, I had thousands of people on my blog. Thousands. Not only that, but EW.com, which was entertainmentweekly.com, did a featured article on my theory and linked back to my blog, which then jumped my my viewer rate of my blog to tens of thousands of viewers per month on my blog. By the way, this is December 2005. And I'm like, wow. And then all of a sudden, everybody's like, man, I love your theory. I heard you should have your own audio podcast. And it didn't take much to stroke my ego at the time. And I'm like, I like that idea. So I went to Best Buy, picked up a headset with a little microphone off to the side. It wasn't even USB. USB had come out, but that was more expensive than I was willing to pay for something that I was going to play around with as a hobby. So I spent $35 on this headset, and it had 1/8-inch plug for a microphone and 1/8-inch plug for the headphones. And I plugged that into my Hewlett-Packard laptop, downloaded some software that I read about on the internet called Audacity, and spoke into it. And I recorded my first podcast on my own about the TV show Lost. And I think that first episode had about 500 downloads. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. And then I asked my wife, I said, do you want to join me? Do you want to be a part of this podcast with me? Yeah, you're the one who introduced me to the show Lost. I think we could have a lot of fun, you and I, talking about what we've experienced. She said, sure. And so I went and bought a mixer with 2 microphones, and we sat down and we started recording our thoughts. And by our 3rd episode, we had been invited there. I told you there was already some Lost podcasts out there, and they created this thing called the Lost Podcast Network. It was a shared podcast feed on Blogger at the time. All of the independent podcasters had their own podcast feeds, but they all had access to log into this Blogger account where you could syndicate or duplicate and re-upload your content to their feed as well. And they invited me to join that. Well, they had already been doing this for months, and Lost was a show watched by millions of people around the world. So by our 3rd episode of the Lost podcast, Stephanie and I had 27,000 subscribers.
At this time, were you thinking of this as a side hustle, or this is just purely a passion project?
This is purely a passion project.
But you're having so much fun.
Oh gosh, I had never had so much fun in my life. I mean, it's like, well, just to give you an idea, another peek back into my past is, as a kid, I was probably 13 years old. My mom had this CB radio base station, a realistic art Radio Shack base station CB. And of course, all technology that comes into the house, I confiscate it and I use it for my own purposes.
Yeah, I'm noticing all the tech ends up in your room.
Exactly. So the thing is of course, I know what the laws are, but regardless of knowing what the laws are, I broke them. And I actually used CB radio. I lived in northern Kentucky, which is just over across the river from Cincinnati, Ohio. And I illegally broadcasted my own weekly radio show via Channel 11 to Price Hill. And I literally keyed up the mic and I kept it keyed up and I did my own. If you listen to my podcast called The Cliff Ravenscraft Show, basically that I did via CB radio. And then I would actually unkey the microphone to take in listener feedback.
Wow.
And so this was me. It's like, I thought it was the coolest thing in the world when I was 13 and I could talk to people on the other side of the river, right? Here I am. I literally Stephanie and I are recording this podcast and we have people from Hong Kong leaving us feedback, Sri Lanka, all over the UK, Russia, Qatar. I'm like, what is Qatar? I thought it was an instrument, but it's actually, there's a country called Qatar. And oh my gosh, we had people all over the world leaving us feedback. And here's the deal. Now, remember the ministry background, right? And my love for tech. And remember, I told you how when I wasn't doing enough tech, I wasn't really enjoying my job as much. So I have a love for tech. I have a love for ministry and serving people and educating people. And here's the interesting thing. So Stephanie and I are just playing around with this as a hobby, recording our weekly podcast about the TV show Lost. But the TV show Lost has episodes titled All Good Cowboys Have Daddy Issues. Well, guess what? Stephanie has some good daddy issue stories she could tell. I have good daddy issues I could tell. And we would share how what's being portrayed in this television show, how we resonate with it from our own stories of life. And then there was an episode called Tabula Rasa, which means starting over with a clean slate. And so we would talk about our own faith journey and how that, is applicable to what they've got going on here and how you can evaluate their chance to start over with a new life on this island. And there was an episode called the 23rd Psalm where they had this guy that was supposedly a Catholic priest, but he misquoted the 23rd Psalm. And so in that episode, I shared what the actual 23rd Psalm is correctly quoted to say and how the slight changes were made, how that actually might indicate what's going on the island. And so people were hearing us tell our stories. And the next thing you know, people weren't just leaving us feedback about the show. People are like sending in emails. Like one person says, "Hey, Cliff, I hope you don't find this offensive, but are you and your wife, Stephanie, are you Christians?" And I wrote back to that person via email, like, "Yes, we are." And this person would write back and say, well, first of all, the response, if I would have printed it out, would have been like 3 to 5 pages. And it said stuff like, "Man, I've never met Christians who watched secular television and who enjoyed life. All I knew Christians to be were these judgmental, holier than thou people. But you and your wife, you have so much fun, and it's causing me to reevaluate, is it possible to be a Christian and be a real human being that
you're allowed to have fun?"
Yeah. And so we get people say, "Cliff, can you tell me how you became a Christian? I mean, how does one logically come to the conclusion that God is real?" And so I said, "Do you mind if I record a podcast episode about that?" And so we realized that the same questions were we're getting hundreds of emails because we've got 27,000 subscribers, hundreds of emails coming in every week. And there was common themes over and over again. So my wife and I started a second podcast where we could talk about anything we wanted. And that's where these common questions about faith, about family, about marriage, about living debt-free, we started creating this content. And next thing you know, we're getting emails from people saying, "Listen, as a result of you and your wife, I've decided not to commit suicide. As a result of you and your wife and your podcast and the content that you're putting out, I left my wife a year and a half ago and my 3 kids, and I've decided I've moved back in. We've reconciled our marriage as a result of your content." And we've got letters after letters. We got postcards from all over the world. And remember, I told you what really excited me about my insurance job is that it's like, man, I feel like, wow, I guess I am doing ministry here. Well, it was nothing like the ministry that's happening through the podcasting.
Yeah, it sounds like the reach that you were having, the number of emails, so the impact eclipsed the insurance good work that you were doing.
That's exactly right. And what happened was I got to the place where the amount of impact and influence I could have in the world through this hobby was so far greater than what I was having in my day job. Because I mean, yes, all of the good that I said I was doing previously in our conversation, the reality is that 80 to 85% of my day was, hi, yes, how can I help you? Oh, you need to delete that car and add a new car? Sure. Oh, you need me to fax you proof of insurance cards? Sure. Oh, you need me to report a claim for you? Sure. Oh, you need me to do this? Sure. It was mostly customer service, 85% of the time. And it got to the place where, quite frankly, my time spent in the insurance office, I felt I began to despise it, and it got to the place where I felt like it was a major distraction from what I really felt most called to do in this world, which is this entertaining people, educating people, encouraging and inspiring people. I mean, here's the thing. In one podcast episode, my wife and I did an episode in 2007 called Living Debt Free, and it reached thousands of people, and that got thousands of people to begin their debt-free journey. And it took us 1 hour to record that podcast episode. And I'm like, this is what I'm supposed to do in the world. And it took a while, by the way. It took about 1.5 years before I finally said, you know what? What would life be like if I could do this for a living instead? And when I eventually got around to actually saying those words out loud in a podcast episode, I had all these people called, what's that word? Entrepreneurs? I had all these people out there who had made a living their entire life by working for themselves, emailing me and offering phone calls saying, Cliff, let me give you 10 different ways you could replace your income by doing, something related to podcasting. And of course, by this time, a ton of people had been asking me, how do you podcast? And I would offer to help them for free because, I have a passion for helping people and I knew how to do all this stuff. It comes naturally to me. And so eventually somebody said, well, Cliff, let me pay you for this. I'm like, you don't need to pay me. Seriously, what's your PayPal email address? I'll send you some money. And so people were just sending me money. And then people said, how much would it cost? And I was like, well, how about I just do a webinar? I'll host it for 10 people and it'll be $150 a piece. And so I did that. And then I had 10 people pay me $150 a piece to do a webinar. And I'm like, wow. And then 3 of those people said, Cliff, I would have paid you 10 times this for what you just taught me. Oh my gosh. And one person says, listen, I'm a professional. I make, a good deal of money. I go to conferences and it's not unlikely for me to spend $2,000 on a ticket to a conference and then another $2,000 in airfare, hotel, and meals to be away from my business. Spending about $5,000 to go to a conference for an entire weekend. I just learned more in 90 minutes from you than I did at any weekend conference that I spent $5,000 on. And that's the kind of feedback I was getting over and over again. And they said, you should do this for a living. And every time something like that happened, I basically came home and tell Stephanie about it. And by September of 2007, I'm probably making somewhere around $3,000 a month consistently just doing this as a hobby, just on the side. I had already launched in December 2006. I launched a podcast called Podcast Answer Man. And that at episode number 1, I said, listen, hey, I don't, it seems kind of arrogant for me to call myself the podcast answer man. There's certainly people out there that know more than I do about podcasting. I may not have all the answers, but here's what I have to tell you. I am the podcast answer man because if I don't have the answer, I know where to get the answer and I will. That's who I am. I'm the podcast answer man. And it says, I said in that first episode in December 2006, I think it'd be cool if maybe one day, maybe when my dad retires, maybe 5-10 years down the road, maybe I could actually do podcast coaching and consulting full time. Well, fast forward 1 year, I was doing it full time.
I think it's safe to say that most people know you as the podcast answer man because you have impacted so many people. You inspired people to launch podcasts. I listened to your show as an aspiring podcaster. There was a point in time when you looked at the Apple Podcasts back then, iTunes, top 100 podcasts, and you directly touched like half of the shows on that list or some big number.
Yeah. So in the business category alone, if you looked at the top 100 business podcasters, more than 60 of them I personally trained how to podcast. And I have personally, as a coach and consultant, have trained thousands of people how to podcast since January 2008. And if you look at the number of people who used my free tutorials, how to launch a podcast, I've helped tens of thousands. And so I would say probably somewhere around 40 to 50,000 people who have a podcast today learned how to podcast from me.
That is huge. And I am one of them. Can I ask you, when you left the agency to strike out on your own, how was that received from your family?
Well, first of all, I did a podcast announcing to the world that I was going to go in the next day to put in my notice so that I wouldn't chicken out. And because once I put it out publicly, then I have to live up to what I just said I was going to do. So I went in the next morning, and I was expecting my dad to kind of try to talk me out of it. But remember, when I started working at the insurance agency, remember the two things that I told them. I said, number one, you've got to promise me you'll never force me to get a license to sell insurance. And they never did force me. They just gave me incentives that were hard to pass up as a young married guy, right? Who had lots of debt at the time. But remember, the second commitment is if I ever had an opportunity to go into ministry full time, regardless of how little money I might make, they had to be okay with that. And in a way, my desire to go into podcast coaching and consulting full time was really the podcast coaching and consulting was just a method of paying the bills that would allow me the freedom and flexibility to do this ministry full time, if you know what I mean.
Right. That's how you figured out how to monetize.
Exactly. So I went into my dad's office, and I really expected him to be upset because remember, all the documents have already been done for me to take over the agency. So I'm sure he's going to be very upset. He's going to tell me how stupid and idiotic this is and all this stuff.
Right. The succession plan was in place.
Exactly. So I go in, and he's like, dude, I've been waiting for months for you to come in and tell me this. And I'm like, really? He goes, yeah, I think this is the most exciting thing that I've heard. And he goes, I fully support you. And this is what my dad said to me. You know how much money you could make here if you stay. When I retire and this agency is yours, you know how much money you can make. And we're talking somewhere minimum between $1 to $1.5 million per year in personal income. So that's what my dad is saying. In September of 2007, he says, you know how much money you could make if you stay here. And I'm like, yes. He goes, here's what I want to tell you. There's no chance in my mind that you will fail at what you're going to do. And in fact, I'm absolutely convinced that ultimately, in the end, you'll make many times over doing what you're getting ready to do than you would ever make in insurance.
Wow. So he was your biggest cheerleader.
He was. But the thing is I got to tell you that I gave him a 90-day notice. And about halfway through, I'm freaking out. I have no business experience, right? So about halfway through the 90-day notice, I'm like, hey, Dad, I got a question for you. And he says, so what's that? I said, what if after January 1st, what if I work for you Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and I have every Tuesday and Thursday off, so I can work Tuesday and Thursday, Saturday and Sunday on my business while it's ramping up income? And he goes, no. He says you either give up this and put everything you have into that, or give up on that and stay here. But you can't have your cake and eat it too. And he says, and if you want my opinion, I think going after what you love is what you should do. And he told me, he says, if you fail, which I don't think you will, but if you fail, you could always come back here.
So you could jump out of the plane, but you had a parachute on.
Exactly. So what happened is I left, and I was a miserable failure at business my first year.
Yes, I heard that you made $11,000 in that first year, and you were working all day, every day.
all day, every day. Well, actually, for the first 9 months, I worked 12 to 14 hours a day, 7 days a week. I never took a single day off for the first 9 months. After 9 months, I took Sundays off, but only after I agreed to myself that I would increase the number of hours than the other 6 days of the week. And the business was profitable. It paid for health insurance benefits. It paid for all the overhead. I was making somewhere between $5,000 to $6,000 per month in business income. But that was covering health insurance. That was covering all this other stuff. But quite frankly, when it all came down to it, for the first 9 months, I didn't draw a paycheck. So there was all kinds of creative ways that we found to pay the bills without going back into debt, because we were debt free. And that was one thing. I would not take out any debt to do this. And we made it. And then by the end of the first 9 months, what also allowed me to get to the place where I could take a day off is that I found a little bit of success, and I found some things that were working well. And so I started taking a day off, and I started paying myself a paycheck for the first time. And so when it was all said and done, those final 3 months after taxes, I made $11,000 in personal income. So that was my first year in business. And I will tell you that January 2009, as a result of that year and what I did what I lacked to do physically, I never went outside. I never left the office. It was a very unhealthy amount of stress. And I ended up in the hospital with massive gallstones. And as a result of a doctor's error in some documentation, I almost died in the hospital. I was in there for 2 weeks and almost died. And man, that completely woke me up to some realities. And then I came back and I'm like, I want to approach things from a different perspective. That's when I really started this personal development and professional self-help kind of interest in learning how to improve who I am and how I show up in the world. And once I did that, man, things really started taking off. And so 2009 was a whole lot better. And then it was actually October of 2010 was when my life radically changed. And that's when I started my very first mastermind after being inspired by the book Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill.
Wow. Cliff, you cracked the code. I know that you're a big advocate of masterminding, and you have the Green Room Mastermind with some very well-known entrepreneurs. You built your Podcast Answer Man brand for, 10 or 12 years. I mean, it was very successful.
12 years.
How did you come to the decision to leave that one?
Well, the thing is the first thing to know is that I never left my career in insurance so that I could be the podcast answer man. That was never my goal. My goal was to leave. One of the reasons why I left my insurance job is because, quite frankly, remember my dad said, I've been waiting for 3 months for you to come in and tell me this. The thing is it was no secret to anybody in the office that I was spending about 70% of my 40 hours a week doing anything other than insurance work. I was literally answering hundreds of emails while I was at work, and I was taking those emails and prioritizing the kinds of questions, and I was outlining podcast episodes while I was at work. I mean, that's and quite frankly, I started feeling very guilty about how I was spending my time at work. And so for me, I'm like, I got to find a way to get out of here so that I want to be able to find a way to make money so I can provide for my family, so that I can actually have the freedom and flexibility to do all of this kind of ministry style stuff, this serving others that I feel so called to do and that fulfills me so much. So remember, it's like, gosh, in 2008, I made $11,000. Most difficult year financially I've ever had in my life, and a lot of emotional ups and downs. But gosh, it was the most fulfilling and most rewarding year of my life up to that point. And so that's what drove me.
Cliff, when you make these pivots in your career, is it because of the calling that you're feeling? Like you're being called to be doing something else?
Yes, I'm always following my heart of who am I and why am I here? And why did I pivot from Podcast Answer Man? And the reality is that when it comes to how can I make a living, that's I got to tell you that I do not feel guilty. Back in the day, I used to probably feel guilty about doing anything for the money, because I had been taught somewhere along the journey that doing things for the money seems to be a greedy way to live life. And I'm like, that's ridiculous now that I think back at it. But anyway, the reality is that I needed to find a way to pay the bills, to support my wife and my kids without going back into debt. And so for me, podcast coaching and consulting was the only marketable skill that I really wanted to pursue. It's not the only marketable skill that I had. I had another marketable skill, selling insurance, right? I decided that's not the marketable skill I wanted to rely on. Another marketable skill that I had was just general technology. But I didn't want to be helping people take malware off of their computers and backing up data and setting up computer networks for people. That's not how I wanted to spend my time. All of those things would have kept me from being able to spend as much time as I wanted to interacting with a global community in ways that made their lives better. So podcast coaching and consulting, my just natural ability to know how mixers work, what cables you need, and being able to communicate and teach that to the average person. Like one of my favorite people that I worked with throughout my years as podcast answer man was Kay Kopit, 72 years old, and she takes my podcasting A to Z course, and literally just through my online podcasting A to Z course, and I'm only interacting with her through a discussion forum, she literally, through my instructions, set up her own podcast and podcasted for, I think she podcasted for 6 or 7 months before she ultimately ended up stopping it. But still, if I can help a 72-year-old woman through my training, it's like, yeah, this is a marketable skill. And obviously, with the number of people that I told you I've helped, it's helpful. And, it was very lucrative as well. But here's what happened was I realized that I had first of all, I realized I had one other very marketable skill after a decade. And that is I learned a lot of things that don't work in building an online business. And guess what? I learned quite a few things that do work in building an online business. And not only did I learn a lot of things about what does and doesn't work from my own journey, but some of my closest personal friends are Michael Hyatt, Dan Miller, Michael Stelzner, Pat Flynn, Ray Edwards. I mean, I'm connected, and not only do I know these people, but I'm meeting with them on a weekly basis, and I know all of the things that they're making as far as mistakes and all the things that they're doing that are succeeding. And the next thing you know, after a decade of doing life with those people and having my own very profitable business, that there's been a couple times where I've made $750,000 in a single year. And by the way, solopreneur, right? So my overhead costs are extremely low. And so I'm like, man, over time, I've developed a very awesome marketable skill as a business mentor. And so I could do some business mentoring. Now, not only that, but I have always had a marketable skill, even when I left my career as an insurance agent, but I had a very difficult limiting belief at the time. And that is, I did not see my gifts and talents as an entertainer, educator, encourager, and a motivator. I did not see what really is my greatest asset in this world and my most important calling in this world. I never believed that was a marketable asset that people would pay for the first 10 years after leaving my career in insurance. But after I began to see that actually what most people, it started to dawn on me, Andy, when I had students who came through podcasting A to Z. They spent $2,000 to go through my 4-week online course to have access to me as their coach for 4 weeks. And by the end of their first time through the course, they successfully launched their podcast. And then 3 months later, that same student is now signing up for another $2,000 for 4 weeks of access to me. And they're not asking me anything about podcasting. It's just through the course they realize that Cliff's okay with me asking questions outside of podcasting. So they're asking me questions about my mindset. They're asking me questions about how did I handle this? Have you ever had this come up? And how do you deal with this situation and this kind of feedback and other business related questions. And if it was just one person that came through 3 or 4 times through podcasting A to Z, that'd be one thing. But I had about 7 different students who went through podcasting A to Z 3 or 4 times each. And I realized and what I started to learn and hear from people, Cliff, it's not the technology that I've come to you. That's what initially drew me to you. But what I most get from you is I love having access to the way you think, the way you process information. I am so drawn to just your worldview and the way I feel so encouraged. I'm always motivated. I'm always inspired. And when I talk to you, when I engage with you in any way, I always am able to do like 10 times the amount afterwards than I was able to do before engaging with you. And that's why I'm so drawn to you. And it just took me a little while to start saying, I wonder what, remember, after about a year and a half of podcasting as a hobby, I'm in insurance and I'm saying, I wonder what life would be like if I could do this instead. And by the way, doing this instead was this ministry, but how could I do it and get paid? And of course, podcast coaching consulting seemed to be the obvious thing. Well, after about 10 years of doing podcast coaching and consulting, quite frankly, I got just as bored answering questions about cables and mixers and microphones as I did about, faxing people proof of insurance cards all day.
Yeah, but Cliff, what is the best microphone?
I don't care. It doesn't matter.
So there was a natural progression from podcast answer man to mindset answer man. Can you share with the Inspired Money listener what you're doing today and what you're doing specifically with the Free the Dream conference?
Yeah, so what I realize is the biggest impact that I was having in people's lives goes all the way back to the kind of feedback that I told you I was getting when I was an insurance agent. Cliff, I listened to the content that you're creating, and I've made a decision to go back and start to reconcile with my wife and be the dad I was called to be. Cliff, as a result of listening to you and your wife talk about your debt-free journey, I want you to know it's been 3 years since you guys put that episode out. I'm calling you to tell you and Stephanie we're debt-free before we call Dave Ramsey. That's the kind of impact that I've always been having, and I never realized its value. And I've never realized it as a marketable skill until about 10 years into the journey. And I started asking myself, what would life be like if I could make a living by encouraging others? Wow, what would life be like? What would I do? And I'm like, is there anybody out there that does anything? And it's like, the only person that comes to my mind is Tony Robbins. And I didn't know much about Tony Robbins at the time, except for he was this motivational guy that really a lot of people are inspired and transformed lives and stuff like that. And so I'm like, well, I wonder how Tony Robbins does this. And so my friend Ray Everett says, why don't you go to a Tony Robbins event and buy some of his materials? And so that's exactly what I did. And I went to Unleash the Power Within with my wife, Stephanie, and it transformed my life and my belief system. And I studied his materials, and I'm like, this is what I'm on this earth to do. I want to help people break free from limiting beliefs that are holding them back from living the lives for which they were created to live. That's who I've always been. I want to take all of my experiences, good and bad, my successes and failures, and I want to share them with people, everything that I'm learning, in hopes that number one, I want to provide some entertainment throughout their day and throughout their life. I want to make sure that everything that I do, that they're always learning something from what I'm learning. And I want to encourage them and give them hope that they can change. And then not only that, I don't want to just encourage them that they can, but I want to inspire and motivate them into action so they're literally transforming their lives. And I'm like, listen, and I read a book called The Big Leap by Gay Hendricks, and I learned that this is what was my zone of genius. He calls it the zone of genius. And I'm like, listen, I want to spend a minimum of 80% of my life inside of my zone of genius doing this, creating content and having products and services that allow me to motivate, encourage, entertain, educate, inspire people. That's what I want to do. And I don't want any of it have to do with all this technical stuff about podcast cables. And so I'm like, well, if I was to shut down podcasting A to Z, how could I make a living? And I went to my whiteboard and I wrote down 10 different product ideas where each of the 10 different product ideas would generate $240,000 a year of income on their own. And I chose 3 of them and I said, well, I'm going to pursue these 3 equally. And I discarded all the other ones off the list. And so what I did is I said, okay, I'm just going to stop all podcast related products and services, literally gave up 100% of my income overnight. I took away, you cannot buy a product from me related to podcasts, consulting, and coaching today. So shut down all of my income and instantly replaced it through paid mastermind groups. And then I also had live workshops on business training. And my wife and I just recently did a thriving marriage workshop, our very first one just recently. We had 4 couples come in here and their marriages were transformed that weekend, which was amazing. So I had these very lucrative in-person live workshops that people come into our Next Level studio for. And then I also launched last year the Free the Dream conference. And this is a conference that is unlike most any other out there. A majority of the conferences that we attend today in this entrepreneurial space it's a lot of strategy. It's like, come and hear from the experts on how to get more people into your funnels, onto your mailing list, how to use Facebook ads more effectively, and all these different tools. Here's how you get your brand out here. Here's how you get more recognition, how you get on more people's radar. It's all about the strategy. And what I learned from Tony Robbins is that success in any area of life, and certainly business, is 20% strategy and 80% mindset. And what I realized over the years is the number of people who go to event after event, conference after conference, take online course after online course, and there's always a gap between what they know that they should do, what they say they're going to do, and what they actually end up doing.
So your focus is on mindset?
It's all on mindset. That's why I'm the mindset answer man. So today I help people discover why there's a gap between what they know that they should do or what they say they're going to do and what they actually are experiencing in their day-to-day life today. And once I have a chance to get on a phone call with them or in a workshop with them or at a conference, I literally show them why there's that gap. And then I give them mindset techniques on how to bridge the gap. And that's what I do is I help people. Number one, I help people rediscover their ability to dream, because the number one piece of feedback when I started the Free the Dream marketing was, well, Cliff, I don't even know if I have a dream. And I'm like, I know why. And come to Free the Dream and you'll discover what your dreams, not singular, your plural dreams are. And number two, for those of you who have dreams and you've been trying to achieve your dream, but you fail miserably over and over again, it's like one step forward, 2 steps back. Come to Free the Dream. I'll teach you why that is. And it's been amazing to see the transformation in people's lives. And before I ever did it through Free the Dream conference, I was doing it through one-on-one mentoring people. So it took me about 2 years to the place where I felt confident that, yeah, I could replace my podcast coaching and consulting income with mindset answer man related products and services. So it took me 12 years to get to this amazing place of profitability where I'm making tons more money as the podcast answer man than I would have ever dreamed of in insurance. But it only took me 18 months to completely replace that income with brand new products and services. And that's where I am today.
I love that. Cliff, I like to ask all the Inspired Money guests, how do you define success?
Success for me, I'm going to borrow this quote from Earl Nightingale, who did The Strangest Secret. Success in my mind is anyone who wakes up and is going to do that day what they intentionally decided that they wanted to do that day.
That's perfect. I love it. Well, thank you, Cliff, for sharing your personal story and your journey and all these changes that you've made throughout your life with intention and purpose. Can you tell the Inspired Money listener where they can follow you and find out more?
Well, before you do anything else, I want you to go to mindsetanswerman.com/free and get access to the opening keynote address from the Free the Dream conference. And there I will teach you a formula that will help you understand why you're actually living the life circumstances that you're living today. And there's one phrase that you will discover, and that is, all beliefs have consequences. And in this it's a 1-hour conversation. In this 1-hour opening keynote for Free the Dream, you will discover where your beliefs have come from, how they're keeping you from living the life for which you were created, how to evaluate them, how to get rid of the limiting beliefs and replace them with beliefs that will empower you to live the life for which you were created. In 1 hour, it can transform your life if you go to mindsetanswerman.com/free.
Yes, and I can testify that I watched yesterday. It's fantastic. You can even watch Cliff rip up some $300 bills.
Yes, you can.
Thank you so much, Cliff.
Andy, thank you so much again for this opportunity. It really means the world to me, and I'm so thankful that we had an opportunity to meet last year at Podcast Movement.
So what was your favorite inspired money moment? I'm impressed by Cliff's ability to try new things, check his gut, and pivot. Whether it was his father's insurance agency, where he could have eventually taken over and made a great income, or the podcast Answer Man, already a successful brand, Cliff is not afraid to take the leap, leaving seemingly secure things behind to launch something new. I find that really admirable. I hope that you enjoyed today's episode and learned something. Maybe you want to start a side hustle, or perhaps you just need to change your mindset to launch something new. Thanks again for joining me on this mission. If you had a different favorite inspired money moment and takeaway, let me know by posting in the private Inspired Money Makers Facebook group at inspiredmoney.fm/Facebook. The music you're listening to right now and all other music on today's show is by the amazing Jim Kimo West. Have an inspired week and do something that scares you, because that is where the magic happens.